Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Tom Holland and Chris Pratt go on a quest to restore their father in the Pixar adventure Onward. Set in a fantasy world that has largely given up magic for the conveniences of technology, young elf Ian Lightfoot, voiced by Tom Holland, has just turned 16 but still struggles with anxiety and embarrassment, especially of his role-playing obsessed older brother Barley, voiced by Chris Pratt. His mother Lowell, voiced by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, brings Ian and Barley a birthday gift left by their late father of a staff, a phoenix gem, and a visitation spell that will bring him back to life for 24 hours. However, when the spell goes wrong and the gem shatters, their father is only restored up to the waist, so now Ian and Barley, with their dad's legs in tow, go on a journey to find a new phoenix gem before time runs out. Onward is the first of two Pixar films released in 2020, the second being Soul, starring Jamie Foxx. This one's directed by Dan Scanlon, who previously held Monsters University for the company, and he also co-wrote the screenplay. And for Scanlon, this seems like a deeply personal project, because the inspiration came from him and his own experiences. You see, Scanlon's father died when he was very young, before he could even remember him, but he managed to get a recording of his father and imagined a scenario where he got the chance to meet him, if only just for a day, by magical means. In fact, this scenario is even worked into the movie itself. There's an early scene where Ian listens to a tape recording of his father and has a conversation with him, syncing with the dialogue on the tape. It's an incredibly affecting scene, especially when you know the backstory behind the film, and that only goes to show how moving and poignant Onward can be in its best moments. That comes to define the film's approach, which at first glance is a big adventure story set in a fantasy world, but in actuality is surprisingly small scale, especially because there isn't that many speaking parts, and it only takes place across a day and a half or so. In fact, that's where a lot of the humour comes from, taking these tropes of the genre and transplanting them into a almost mundane setting that renders them comically small. But really, this movie is about two brothers and their father, and the relationship that they share as they try and recapture magic, both literally and metaphorically. They're making up for lost time. They're going on the road trip together that they never got the chance to. And in that way, I think because of that, the movie never loses sight of the characters. That is what is at the forefront of the movie, even though it does have these big set-piece moments, especially as the film moves into the third act, where they go into these Indiana Jones-style booby traps. There's even a sequence where Ian has to walk across a huge chasm whilst going across an invisible bridge, which is very Last Crusade of him. But this is always rooted in the characters, especially in Ian's fears and neuroses. As you would expect, Tom Holland is perfectly cast playing Ian, given he's pretty much called the marker on awkward, insecure teenagers. And Ian as a character defines himself by his relationship with his father, even though he's never met him, and yet he feels this constant pressure to live up to him, to aspire to be him and who he was, or at least an imagined version of what he thinks his father was, and as such, that's taking away from his own self-confidence. And much of Ian's journey over the course of the film is to find his own assertiveness, to recapture his own magic, both figuratively and literally, because Ian is the one of the pair who has the aptitude for magic. Not everyone can do in this world, but to do so at his fullest potential, he needs to overcome his own anxieties and step into his own identity rather than just defining himself by his late father. And quite symbolically, in many of the earliest scenes of this film, Ian is wearing his dad's hoodie, but for much of the adventure, he takes that off again, especially to assert his independence. Of course, it also helps that Holland has tremendous chemistry with his Marvel co-star Chris Pratt, very well cast in the role of older brother Barley, who maybe only has 3 memories of his father, but nevertheless carries a lot of his dad's spirit, especially in his passion for magic and the way that he's very invested in role-playing games, which in this world are taken directly from magic of old times, and suddenly there's a bit of an environmentalist, almost hippie kind of vibe to the character, especially in the way that he goes around in his his van with a unicorn painted on the side of it that he calls Guinevere, and Pratt is so affable in the role. He's such a charming presence, and that works for the character, who is very, very well-meaning, if a little bit clumsy and oafish at times, but nevertheless is extremely determined and fearless in his own way. He's almost a contrast to his brother, but because of that, he pushes him along. I think that he gives him a lot of encouragement along the way, and the relationship that the two share is the real heart of the film. As such, because there is such great chemistry between the two performers, you can almost certainly tell they recorded at least some of their dialogue together because they bounce and riff off of each other so well, especially in the comedic scenes, and that helps really sell the brotherly affection that is the crux of this story. And then you have the relationship that they each have with their father, which obviously does get emotional, but for a lot of it is quite humorous because he's just a pair of legs, and that becomes one of the movie's funniest running gags. It definitely exploits that idea to its fullest potential as he's being dragged along on a little lead with this makeshift upper half and he's flopping around. He doesn't quite know where he's going. It's almost kind of Weekend at Bernie's-esque, where the lack of physicality becomes a physicality. But even if he is just a pair of legs, there is still some level of autonomy there, and because of that, there is a reversal of the dynamic that should be there, where instead of him being a father to them, they essentially had to become parents to him, and he is this runaway child that is constantly inadvertently causing trouble and havoc or wandering off into danger. They're the ones that have to look after him. It's both sweet and also quite amusing at the same time. However, while a lot of care has been paid to the central trio, it feels like not enough attention has been paid to the world that's going on around them, and that's one of the big disappointments of Onward, in that it never takes advantage of its interesting premise. The way the movie starts out, it could almost be a satire of our modern world, perhaps stating how we've moved too far away from practical skills because technology makes everything faster and easier, but if there is commentary there, it largely gets lost after the opening, and it really is a shame that Onward's modern fantasy world looks too much like our own, with a lot of brief sight gags. For example, someone pulls out a carton and it's labelled low rat milk. That's not very imaginative or inspiring. There's very little consideration for the fact also that this world started from a very different starting point to our own. You can see this in comparison to something like Zootropolis or Zootopia, where the world in that movie was built around the fact they had species of varying sizes, and so obviously they had to accommodate for that. But in Onward, where they have creatures, again, varying in size, it's all built at the relative size of elves, even though you've got tiny pixie bikers, for example, or centaurs who struggle to get in their police cars for quick sight gags. It doesn't really make sense as an environment, and that lets down the film consistently, because at a certain point, I did actually ask the rather head-scratching thing that you're not supposed to say in an animation, which is, why is it not done in live action? I actually thought to a certain extent you could almost do this with a bunch of live action performers just wearing elf ears. It feels like the setting is only there to accommodate the magic of the plot rather than to take advantage of the medium, and that's so unfortunate for Pixar because they've proven in the past they can do better than this. You only have to look at Coco or Monsters Inc. Heck, the director of this came off Monsters University, so that feels like an especially big own goal in that regard. I will say though, the animation, as you would expect, is top notch, even if I don't think this is really much of a stretch for the animators at Pixar, and going into the third act, especially the climax, there are some more creative ideas there. I especially like a really, really great take on a creature design going into the finale. I think if the movie had that more consistent level of inspiration, it would have made something that felt distinctive whilst also familiar at the same time. As it stands, it feels like a metaphor is how many of the winged creatures go around by other means. It's rather symbolic of a film that doesn't take flight in the way that it really should do. Speaking of which, Octavia Spencer's Manticore is a good example of this, in that she's initially established as having transformed her Traveller's Tavern into this family restaurant pastiche of itself, and she's overworked and embarrassed about this, and her encounter with the two brothers inspires something within her. She snaps, and it's this really unexpected comic sequence, but then the movie doesn't really know what to do with that character. Instead of taking her from that point, it's like she reverts back to type, and then afterwards, she simply becomes an expository character, and that's a real shame because Spencer does well when she gets the comedic moments, but it feels like the movie squanders what it initially establishes for that character. A lot of the time, she's in the second road trip of the movie because she tags along with Julia Louis-Dreyfus as the boy's mother who is chasing after them, but again, they put those two characters together, they don't really do a whole lot in the grand scheme of things. There is an amusing sequence where they encounter someone at a pawn shop voiced by Tracy Ullman and try to get back something, but aside from that, it feels like the movie doesn't know what to do with this second set of characters up until the very end of the movie, and maybe not even then. While Louis-Dreyfus does get a few moments to shine, oddly, the Manticore gets very quickly sidelined. In fact, she pretty much disappears from the climax of the movie, which is very, very odd. But as the film approaches its ending, I think many audiences will be very willing to overlook its flaws because the emotional through line works. I think there's something very universal about the premise. Everyone has lost someone that they want to spend just that little bit more time with, and as such, we're incredibly sympathetic towards the characters. And the way the writing leads in such unexpected ways is very beautiful. I was watching the final scenes of this movie with a real lump in my throat. Certainly Pixar as a studio has never shied away from confronting the issue of death in their films, which are essentially aimed at children and families. Up and Coco are good examples of this, and this is right up there with them. I think the last beats of this movie are so incredibly effective and affecting at the same time. You'd have to have an incredibly hard heart not to be moved by them in some way. It's also worth noting the film was accompanied by a brief Simpsons short called Playdate with Destiny, which, like their last theatrical short, A Longest Daycare, is focused on Maggie, and the best way of describing it is that it's very cute. Maggie goes to a play park and meets a boy that she quite likes there, but unfortunately Homer, being the doofus that he is, takes her to the wrong play park. And this is entirely dialogue free, and because it focuses on the youngest member of the Simpsons family, it has a very different perspective to the rest of the show, which is incorporated into the animation, which toys around with scale and wide angles. And a lot of the humour comes from this, because events seem very dramatic through Maggie's eyes, but then the camera pulls back to reveal things are much more simpler and innocent than they first appear, and it's quite amusing in its own way. It's more significant for the fact that it further reinforces the consolidation of the former Fox assets under Disney, and of course the short makes a number of jokes about this. It opens with a Mickey Mouse silhouette that turns out to be Homer with a pair of donuts above his ears. Likewise, the Gracie Films logo at the end has Mickey Mouse sat in the audience. It does almost feel like maybe testing the waters for maybe a Maggie spin-off movie in her own way. Maybe she can get her own dialogue-free movie in very much the same way as Shaun the Sheep. That could be potentially interesting. For now, this is perfectly fine. Onward is not Pixar's best movie. It's very scrappy and not fully fleshed out, and I wish it took more advantage of its fantasy world, but what it does do, it does extremely well. You have to understand that when reviewing a Pixar movie, you have to grade on a very steep curve. The studio's put out some fantastic films in the past, so when I say that Onward is relatively lower tier up until that ending, It's still a great animated film, it's just not quite up to the same standard that they've set for themselves. If this came out from Illumination or DreamWorks, this would be one of their best movies. But for Pixar, they've shown that they can make even better movies than this. But I do think the movie is extremely effective at telling a very touching story. I think it works as both comedy and drama. It's both crowd pleaser and tearjerker at the same time, and I can definitely see many audiences being extremely affected by this. I just think, for the lack of a better word, it lacks the real magic that Pixar brings to their very best projects. Onward may have some big set-piece moments rooted in high fantasy and adventure, but for the most part it's a small-scale, intimate road movie. On the one hand, this plays towards the strengths of the film, which is the relationship between the two brothers, with a great dynamic between Holland and Pratt's voice work that sells the humour, but also the emotion that drives the story. However, the movie doesn't really take full advantage of the magical locale it's set in, which is often just a modern contemporary one with puns and sight gags substituting for world building and imagination, to the extent that you occasionally wonder why it needs to be animated, although it is of course done to Pixar's usual high standard. Similarly, Julia Louis-Dreyfus and Octavia Spencer are underutilised in their own road trip, but the film's conclusion is genuinely moving and has enough heart to make up for these shortcomings, even if this is a relatively minor entry by Pixar standards. If you like this review, then use your magic over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.